Hello. Hi, Sally.
I'm
And
back.
here we are again. Welcome to Life, Work and Laundry, Relational Hacks to Living Well. I'm Marianne Chidiac.
I'm Sally Denham-Vaughan.
And what we've agreed to start this new year with is the topic of ethical presence, why it's important in organizations and other bits and pieces I think that we are going to find are related to this topic and
Mm,
interesting to
mm,
chat about.
yes.
So, as you can probably tell, I'm stewarding this time. Um, and and I get before jumping into what is ethical presence and why is it important for us, and why it was important for us to
Mm,
write about. I thought it would be a good to start with what is presence more generally, or why the interest in the topic of presence in organizations and in leadership circles, particularly.
mm, mm.
You know, do you want to kick us off on that?
Sure, sure. There's a lot in my mind because I'm thinking that, here we are, we've just survived Christmas. And the various types of presents that crop up at that time of year, turning up, giving gifts, being the life and soul of the party. And I suppose that latter, sort of being the life and soul, being charismatic, being impactful.
Mm.
When I became a leader in an organization and then had leadership training, that was what we were taught, how to be impactful and influence others. And, some people might find it amusing to know I had done a little bit of amateur dramatics in my time and acting. And I remember sort of being told to act into the role of somebody who was confident, stood in a confident pose, imposed myself on the situation, made myself bigger, wore heels, shoulder pads, all
Okay.
this sort of thing. And I remember having a sensation of physically getting bigger
Yes.
and talking louder and projecting more and being told, now you're more present.
Mm, mm, mm.
And I think there was a sense in which occupy as much space and airtime as possible
Mm.
and impact the situation in the way you want.
Yes.
And that was very much the organizational formulation that I was taught.
Yes.
We're going back a fair few years
But
of presence.
yeah, I think you're totally right. Mine isn't that dissimilar. It's very much this charisma. And I think it's fair to say, if you were a woman, you had to work hard at it. And of course, we all remember, some of us remember the 80s with all the shoulder pads. Actually, that was a bit of, trying
Yes,
to become more present in
yes,
organizations, especially for
yes,
women. And I think it's really was seen as either you have it or you don't. It's a very
yes,
much a leadership trait.
yes,
And it was important to have it because then you could influence and
yes,
motivate others to become,
yes,
more active or to do whatever you want. And of course you can imagine that taken to extreme, it was about, how good you were at manipulating or
yes,
enforcing your will.
yes,
And
yes,
and I think, it's interesting to hear your experience when you started. And I guess when I was a management consultant and they would give examples of leadership, and that's sort of a few years back, even when I was there, it was an old example, but everyone would mention the CEO of General Electric. Do you remember Jack Welch? And
yes,
it's because he turned like General Electric around, and he was really seen
yes,
as a in the leadership OD area as the example of what it was to be a leader. And of
yes,
course, when you look at what he used to be, he was like almost revered in his
yes,
organization,
yes,
and
yeah,
he had this thing that he would whatever the performance he would fire 10% of his managers, um, irrespective of their performance, the bottom 10%, yeah,
yes,
and
yes,
reward the top 20%. And you can imagine, here's someone that thought, well, I can do anything, and
yes,
what a toxic culture. uh,
yes,
Even though he managed to get lots done in terms
yes,
of a leader and turn the organization around, you can imagine how competitive it became as an
yes,
environment and also uncollaborative.
yes. Well, I think you've said some very important words there at the end of competitive and not collaborative. And I remember very much the sense of being in a race to see who could be the best competitor. And so you had to be quick, you had to be loud, and you had to really be sort of Teflon coated resilience, that you could take the knocks. And the female example I was presented with was Margaret Thatcher.
Yes.
And I remember thinking, I just feel a million miles away from a Margaret Thatcher sort of character. How am I going to present myself? And I guess when I look back, I think of all the things that she did to present herself in a way that was palatable, that I want to say men, but organizations would take her seriously.
No,
And this idea, particularly for female leaders, and I guess anybody who wasn't an alpha male type, was actually you don't have presence because you're not impacting, aka dominating the situation. And
thank God we're not there.
thank God we're not there.
Listening to you, what's coming up to mind is, a few male leaders that I work with and how attentive they are at the moment, especially in this kind of environment, especially in the UK, not to appear too dominant,
Yes.
not to appear, too masculine almost. And somehow there's a valuing of some feminine traits. So
Yes.
I feel, and I don't know what your view is, but I feel that this view of what it is to be present is much less than what it used to be. It's less of the Jack Welch and more closer to how we're kind of positioning it.
Yes. I think that's right. I mean, I think over the years, maybe the gendered stereotype leader has changed. I mean, as you say, I have a fervent hope that that is the case.
Yes.
And then I look at some of the world leaders and I think maybe there's a bit of a resurgence. But certainly if I go back to Gestalt and the concept of presence initially, I think it was quite closely allied with some of the qualities that we've been talking about. That there was a commanding presence, that you were very almost hyper vigilant in your awareness and very assertive in terms of asking for what you want, and the word even aggressing on the field to get your needs met. And that was equated somehow with a form of presence that, if I look at where we are now, presence as a relational process, very, very different. So,
and I like the fact that it's not saying that you can't aggress, you can't have a will based, but when we defined it as energetic availability and fluid responsiveness, we kind of almost gave a bit more balance rather than charismatic dominant view of presence, which I think is still out there sometimes.
Yes. I think that's really important because, as you say, the formulation of presence as a relational process into being able to move and adapt between energetic availability, which I think we took from that turn up, command, impact, influence, to respond, resonate, be with what actually is, and saying that those two come together to impact presence as a process. That I guess in the theme of our work has been to slightly extend the impact of this responsiveness, resonant quality, and contextual awareness.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, which was missing, and I'm still a bit taken aback by, here I was saying, organizations have shifted since Jack Welch, and then you rightly pointed out, as we look at political leadership, especially at the moment, it's very much going back to the old style, and when you think how much following people like Andrew Tate have got, young men, that very much promotes that sort of presence as dominance. So I'm
Yes.
wondering whether the pendulum felt like it swung too far, and then there's a readjustment here needed. But
I think so. I think that's where the sense of potency, personal potency and power, you know, as agency in a field, maybe it did swing a little bit too much into presence as listening,
yes,
presence as elevation of the other.
yes,
And, you know, in that, a sense that I have no agency. I just am here to facilitate the needs of others, you know, and I think some extreme forms of servant leadership perhaps did promote that,
yes,
you know, that
absolutely.
we went from leader as always right and dominant to leader as always facilitative and leading from behind almost. So just in the service of the other.
Absolutely.
So, you
Yeah.
know, yeah.
No, I was just sort of saying, you know, if I go back to, you know, why is presence important in organizations
Mm,
today, however we look at it,
mm,
is is that a lot of organizations, what they mostly want, if we don't just look at leaders, but even just a regular employee,
mm,
we want everyone, you know, to be present in the sense that to be at your best, to be
yeah.
fully engaged, to really show up, you know, rather than just be doing some quiet quitting, and
Yes.
you know, which is a real issue here, and to you know, show up with their full potential
Yes.
at work.
Yes.
And so, so in presence, organizations, I guess, are looking on how to ensure their staff are at their best,
Mm,
and so going away from presence as an organizational trait and taking more responsibility in organizations to say, okay, how can we organize our processes, our values, our way of operating, our internal dynamics to make sure that these individuals are fully present?
yeah.
Also, just doesn't put so much responsibility on the person, but also
Yeah.
on the system
The
and
whole field.
the whole.
Yeah. I think it's become very relevant. I'm thinking of some organizations I work with at the moment and the speed with which AI is coming in, you know,
Yes,
and how AI will really, I think, come to dominate the knowledge
yes,
sector,
yes,
you know, in some ways, in terms of facts, information, briefings, you know, there's going to be a lot of functions that can be efficiently taken over by AI. And
mm,
that then raises the issue of what is the human contribution?
yes,
What is it? What is the unique human contribution
mm,
that is irreplaceable? And I mean, you know, I hope that there is an irreplaceable part, otherwise we're all in trouble. Um, but I think that will be in the domain of creativity,
yes,
innovation,
yes.
collaboration in a particular way that is more dialogic than confluent.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. More responsiveness, that's for sure.
yes, yes. So, and you know, when I think of how we moved from presence as a relational process through to concept of ethical presence,
Yes,
and I guess what we're really tracking there is how to bring those two aspects of presence together and then use them in a context to create a
yes,
sense of interconnected, interdependent
yes,
life form
yes.
that is organizing, self-organizing,
Yeah,
much more than a command and control mission.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
maybe, you know, this is a good place to move on because, you know, in a way we've talked about in previous, you know, episodes as well on this podcast around the three lenses, you know, of
Mm,
self, other, and situation. And that by attending to these three lenses, by
mm,
being aware of them and not forgetting or occluding one of them,
mm,
we're making a step to be to have a more ethical stance
mm.
uh,
Yeah.
and a more ethical presence. So, do you want to say more about that? You know, about,
Mm.
you know, just stepping ourselves now into more the ethical presence kind of.
Ethical presence and the concept. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, ethical presence for me is a really a relational formulation of presence as a process. It's a radically relational formulation where we take those three lenses
Mm,
and we think at any moment those three are held in a dynamic tension.
mm,
You know, if I lose my groundedness in myself and become wholly sort of into, groupthink and or what you need, then there's something goes missing. I go missing from the potency of the collective shared field.
Yes.
If I efface you, and I get on planet, these are my needs and here's what we're going to do and things like this, and this is what I need in this situation, then I use my power and I might feel incredibly potent, but I lose your contribution. And if we both forget the contextual responsiveness, then really we're in fantasy land, and we're losing our unique human ability to sense make in the moment. And that, I think, is a creative process that is released in the concept of ethical presence, is that we co-emerge in that contextual moment in a creative way to find and innovate solutions that have not been created before. And that capability, I guess, has been what humans have been, and other life forms have been doing since we came on the planet. And that's my great hope going forward, is that relational process will be, not our salvation, but certainly our hope. That's where my hope lies, rather than we're going to use up all the resources that we're presented with in order to satisfy ourselves and our immediate tribes, which seems to be the opposite direction. I think it's a very relational formulation that we've come up with that emphasizes that creative and hopeful ability in humans.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree. It's it's an interesting one of saying, okay, well, I have to stay aware of these three lenses in different ways. I have to inquire into these three lenses constantly. And if I ever find myself polarizing, because there are situations where you do polarize in one of the lenses, I think typically in the self lens, where you place your self-interest. But yeah, so if I fall down and I've broken my ankle, I will polarize in my self-lens, and that's okay to do that.
Yes.
But
Yes.
we often find, a lot of kind of narcissistic behaviors, where self-interest is at the heart, and how to kind of call people leaders on that.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah.
Or at the same time polarizing into other, that sense of, we need to take care of this group, these are the marginalized groups or whatever it is. And then you kind of make a move of almost sacrifice, where you, as a practitioner, let's say, you kind of rescue your client, or you just kind of sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I was thinking as well, here we are on the news this morning. There was all around how NHS trusts, a lot of them, because of the flu, the winter flu, have announced like critical incident status. And here's a situation that is, overwhelming. No wonder everyone's going to polarize into that situation. And we often find that in organizations where you have a crisis going on, and situation is the main thing you need to focus on, but it's not sustainable.
No.
Can't keep operating that way. And this is where, where if you do, then it comes at the cost of the individual's well-being, at the cost of relationships and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very thought-provoking, really, isn't it? Because I'm thinking of the current work that we're developing and offering around bias, and power, and how possibly when we're at our most comfortable, when we think things are going well, that's because conditions are exactly as I would wish them. And not in a conscious, will-based way, but I just feel nice and comfortable with how things are. And our ability to, I think one of the things that we say in ethical presence, in the paper Ethical Presence, is that possibly when we feel good, it's not because of our self-development, our personal awareness, it's because other people in the context are affording us opportunities that are not being afforded to people who feel uncomfortable or marginalized. And I think that's where this work becomes very linked with diversity, representation, intersectionality, in terms of what is the ethical stance towards thinking, well, I'm not pressing my agenda at the moment because I feel very comfortable with what's going on.
Yes. Yes.
So that I think that self-reflection, self-transformation that we are asking of practitioners who come into ROG and the relational change sort of framework, I think does make a huge difference in our ethical stance towards not just how we do business, but how we live, what we want for ourselves, what we want for our kids. All those things, I think, become quite different when we take that view.
Yes, it does. It distinguishes, for me, the situation from what we've called the context or the culture.
Yes.
So because very often this context and culture, which is where we come from, whether we're, you know, what languages we speak, you know, the impact of our gender that has been from within the culture that we're coming from, you know, our race, you know, our sexual orientation, etc. All of that, you know, and how those things are perceived within the context. Sometimes they're not they're not made figure, or they don't play a huge role in the given situation. But then the relational interaction suddenly can make them really very potent. And we often give this example of, you know, what's it like to be at a conference and you're the only one, you know, you're a native English speaker, and while everyone else isn't, you know, how does that, you know, yes, you feel very present, but you know, what's afforded you that presence is interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a big contribution. It's a contribution that I feel proud of, is thinking when I feel comfortable is when I most need to be aware of my privilege. You know, that what's giving me that, and it, I guess it is possible to think, well, that's my self-development that's been hard won, but more likely it's a contextual bias that's actually playing in my favor at that moment. And what is the ethic of just going along with that feeling of comfort? So I guess the aim to disrupt, disturb, question that comes from the concept of ethical presence is challenging. It is a stretch for people in organizations. You know, so it's a move away from business as usual.
It certainly does, and it places more emphasis on, you know, it's not just a straightforward, is everyone okay, kind of check, or a curiosity, or, you know, what often happens, I think, in organizations where people are sent to some sort of away day. So we're kind of making sure everyone's fine. There's a workshop going on, and everyone really needs to be as present as they can. But then it's not enough, you know, this nice context, or there's a nice facilitator there, is not always these self-other situation in the moment lens isn't always enough to ensure good outcome.
No.
There's a lot more dialogue that's needed.
Yes, yes. Well, it's always a good indication, I think, of what I call the away day as spa, you know, sort of rest and relax, really, and bonding, versus the away day as a dialogic possibility where we can really reflect on how things have been. Is it a safe enough space to begin to look at how those lenses of self-other and situation have been playing in our context? How am I viewed if I bring up some of the challenges for me? And how much reach have I got to look at, if I feel comfortable, that probably is giving me privilege that, if I can own, will enable other people to step in, you know. So if this suits me, then I get very curious about who might it not suit.
Yes.
Who's it not working for?
Yes. Totally.
Yeah.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Is it a difficult one to prioritize, because, you know, doing all the inquiry and the dialogue needed to ensure maximum presence takes a lot of time.
Yes.
And that's why it usually develops over time in good teams.
Yes. Yes.
but it's not not always easily reachable in
No.
organizational work.
No. No. I think that's true.
Mm.
Not always easily reachable in life.
In life either.
You know, it's an ongoing practice, I guess. So.
Okay. I wanted to maybe make a side step and talk a bit about creative indifference. Would that be good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think as you speak of ethical presence
Mm.
and the need to keep these three lenses in awareness at all on
Mm.
time and inquire and dialogue over them, it brings up an aspect of Gestalt theory which might at first feel a bit at odds with a stance or way of working. And what I'm referring to is what in Gestalt we call a creative indifference, which
Mm.
seems somehow to imply that in order to fully allow emergence
Mm.
to take place, we need to be indifferent, or at least indifferent to the outcome and let things unfold. I'm wondering, do you want to unpack that a
Mm.
bit and see what your reaction is?
I think it's one of our most complex bits of theory, isn't it? To have the attitudinal stance of creative indifference. What are we actually talking about?
Mm.
I think, Emmanuel Levinas, philosopher, makes the point that this is completely and wholly different from being indifferent. It doesn't mean that I don't care or I've got a sort of whatever attitude. It means that I am passionately wedded to emerging a way forward that works as well as possible for all who are involved. It's not, having said that, it's not a sort of utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number.
No.
But there is a sense of we're trying to navigate a path towards health through a series of what I'd call safe to fail experiments. So it's not that we're just experimenting willy-nilly with let's just try something, and if it goes wrong, we don't care. No, we do care, which is why the setting of the boundaries around the experimenting is so important.
Yes.
And we want what we might call enabling constraints. We want safe to fail experiments. We want to be able to innovate and create from that stance of creativity with a surrendering to the best possible sort of fused
Yes.
form that can emerge in that moment. And that I think is an art of the Gestalt methodology. And, I wouldn't even call it teaching that. People often say, how can you teach creativity? I don't think you can. I guess what we try and do in ROG is create conditions where people can experiment with that in a safe enough setting to be able to offer possibilities to organizations.
Yes.
And I think it's a very important part of ROG.
Yes, I agree. And you can't be creative without being present, without being both willful and responsive.
Absolutely.
Available and responsive.
Yes.
I like that you sort of really clarified this term creative indifference, because I read somewhere that it was almost mistranslated by Pearls, and that Salomo Freelander, who actually is at the heart of this, never translated it into English. And that if it was translated, perhaps the better translation of what he meant was creative undifferentiation or creative impartiality, which means that you are anything but indifferent, but that as a practitioner, you maintain almost a stance of a full interest, extending towards whatever both sides of the differentiation, if you like.
Yeah. Yes.
So there's a strong engagement in that.
Yes.
And it's a following move, isn't it, Sally? As you work with someone, just as you work with creativity, there's a sense of, having to put a bit of energy and also follow where the creativity of the group or an individual takes you.
Yes. It's what I call the sheepdog methodology. I do a little bit of a run out front, and then I very quickly might run around the back, and you are leading, following, holding, encompassing. So, you're really talking there to some of the other qualities of presence about range, flexibility, adaptability, creativity, all those things that come into that moment that you can generate as a role practitioner.
I don't know how long we've been talking, but I feel like it will be a good, if you're okay, just a good wrap up. I'm just wondering, anything else you want to say about the overall topic of ethical presence that perhaps we haven't covered, or just something that's worth emphasizing?
Yeah. Well, when I think of that piece of work, I think it was the hardest to grasp, and I often think you and I were sort of trying to wrestle, grapple, search, reach for something that's very, very hard to put into words. And, sometimes when I read what we wrote on the topic, I think, oh, would I phrase it differently now or anything like that? But I also feel most proud of it, of trying to get something lifted up and looked at in a way that certainly was a big challenge for me to think, oh, maybe when I'm most comfortable, that's when conditions suit me best.
Agreed.
And what does that mean for my practice?
Yes, I agree. And I think there's some satisfaction even on a theoretical point of view, because I think, yes, I agree with you. We both grappled, and I remember that, over a period, it's probably the longest it took us to write something.
Yes.
Where it takes me, it's kind of a reinforcing of the key elements of a Gestalt approach, because what we, revisited and recrystallized for ourselves is that importance of the field theory, the interconnectedness, our belonging within the wider context and the situation, as well as how important for ethical presence was to continuously be curious in terms of a phenomenological inquiry, and then follow through dialogue.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
agree with you.
Yeah.
Oh, great place to stop. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.